darkmyths.org and Neopolis Media Group proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is episode 164 of the Lone Gunman Podcast, Weisberg in New Orleans. Now, the Weisberg I'm of course referring to is that of famed first-generation Warren Commission critic Harold Weisberg. Now, I'm pretty, I guess you would say, blessed to be living close to where Harold Weisberg lived for many, many, many years. And that is, of course, Frederick, Maryland. And this enabled him to make frequent trips to the National Archives to request documents. And that's what he is known for and prided himself on and based his books on, and that is documents. He, of course, was not a fan of many of the first generation Warren Commission critics, such as Mark Lane, Jim Garrison. The list goes on as time goes on and on. But he was not really a fan of crazy conspiracy nut researchers. He liked to pride himself on sticking with what the official documents told us. And he is, of course, a man after my own heart. Of course, I do like to throw out a lot of speculation based on documentation, not just wild speculation. Because I think it's important to do that in order to connect some of this stuff together. Because if you don't, then we're never going to get anywhere, folks. But before we get into Harold Weisberg and the trip that he made to meet Jim Garrison in New Orleans and do a little investigating on his own, I want to address a couple things that I came across, and it involves Oswald in New Orleans, and his dealings with the FBI, and his dealings with Carlos Bringuier, and so on and so forth. And a document, well, I shouldn't say a document, but something that has always confounded me is that when Oswald was arrested on August 9th, following his street fight, in quotes, with Carlos Bringuier, a leader in the Cuban Student Directorate, he was arrested and taken down to the New Orleans City Jail, where he requested to speak to the FBI. Now, the agent that the New Orleans office of the FBI sent down to talk to Oswald was a guy by the name of Quigley, John Lester Quigley, special agent. And over the years, everybody has been wondering, what exactly did Lee Oswald tell Quigley? Or what did he ask him? Or was it nefarious? Because Quigley has been notoriously tight-lipped on his interactions with Oswald and will not and did not and probably never will, as he's probably deceased, elaborate on what him and Oswald spoke about. But, folks, I finally did come across some documentation. And in fact, Quigley wrote a multi-page report on his dealings with Oswald. Now, the first thing I came across, and this was a report from Warren DeBreeze, who was another agent, FBI agent in New Orleans at the time. He wrote a report on Oswald's activities. Now, this is the guy that I believe was working a little more closely with Oswald than he's going to let on. In fact, he follows Oswald to Texas. And I actually have documentation, and me and Doug talked about it on one of the last Quick Hit shows, that actually puts Warren DeBreeze in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, which he vehemently denies that he was. He claims he did not come to Dallas until after the assassination. That is simply not true. And I have the document to prove it. But while they were still in New Orleans, Warren DeBreeze wrote a report on October 25th, 1963. And it concerned the Fair Play for Cuba Committee New Orleans Division. A synopsis of this report, and I shall read, states, information from New Orleans Police Department on August 9th revealed that Lee Oswald was arrested on that date for disturbing the peace along with 3 other Cubans who had objected to Oswald's distribution of FPCC literature. Oswald fined $10 or 10 days on August the 12th in municipal court. New Orleans, Oswald reported to have distributed FPCC literature in New Orleans August 16th along with another unknown white male. Oswald appeared on a radio program on August 21st in a debate against 2 anti-Castro persons, at which time Oswald denied that FPCC is communist-controlled, and he admitted he personally was a Marxist. Oswald reported to have moved from New Orleans on September 25th and believed to have returned to Texas. Apparently they didn't get the memo that he went to Mexico. FPCC handbills distributed by Oswald bore the name of A.J. Heidel, P.O. Box 30016. That box was determined to be non-existent. Cuban sources at New Orleans have no pertinent information regarding anyone named Heidel, and there is no record of any such name in the New Orleans directory or from credit sources. No activity of subject organization observed since August 16, 1963. Now, the details of this investigation of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans was constituted and initiated on the basis of information received from Lieutenant William Gaillot, 1st District NOPD, that the following persons had been arrested on Canal and Baronne Streets in New Orleans: Lee Oswald, Carlos Bringuier, Kelso, Macario, Hernandez, and Miguel Mariano Cruz. Details concerning the above as made available by Lieutenant Gaillot are as follows. Lee Oswald, white male, 23, born October 18, 1939 in New Orleans. Present address 4709 Magazine, New Orleans, Lower Center Apartment. Oswald informed arresting officer that he is a member of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee with headquarters at 799 Broadway in New York City. Lieutenant Gaillot informed that Oswald was handing out yellow leaflets with inscription "Hands Off Cuba" and "Viva Castro." Then it goes into a little bit about Carlos Bringuier, white male, age 29, Adele Street. He is the director of the Cuban Student Directorate for the New Orleans area. He informed me he immigrated to this country on February 8, 1961, and has a clothing shop at 107 Decatur Street. Kelso Macario Hernandez, white male, 47, also of Adele Street, different apartment though. He advised he is a member of the same group as Bringuier. Miguel Mariano Cruz, white male, age 18, of Mazant Street, advised he is also a member of the Cuban Student Directorate. So this short little report put together by Warren DeBreeze goes into lots of things, including just establishing who these people were and where they resided. not much other information is available, maybe he didn't get John Lester Quigley his notes. So now, I found the Quigley report, and this is a multi-page report about what him and Oswald actually talked about at the time of Oswald's arrest when he demanded to speak to the FBI. Mind you, Oswald asked for this. Starting off, Lee Harvey Oswald was interviewed at the 1st District Station, New Orleans Police Department at his request. Oswald said that he had been picked up on August 9th, 1963 by the New Orleans Police Department and was charged with disturbing the peace in the 700 block of Canal Street during the time he was distributing Fair Play for Cuba Committee literature. Now this report is dated 6 days after Oswald's arrest, August 15th. Oswald stated that he was unemployed at the present time, his last employment being terminated July 17th, 1963 as a mechanic with the William B. Riley Company on Magazine Street. He was born, blah, blah, blah. He attended Warren Easton High School, blah, blah, blah. He joined the Marine Corps, blah, blah, blah. All right. All this information we'll skip over. Following his discharge, he moved to Fort Worth, Texas, where he lived with his mother, Marguerite Oswald. He could not recall her residence in Fort Worth, but remarked that she was living now in Arlington, Texas, and was a practical nurse by profession. And this, you notice he left out the whole, he was at home for one day, I think was his mother, before he left to make his way to Russia. Now this next little bit's interesting. He says, about 4 months ago, he and his wife, Marina Oswald, that means born, Prosa, whom he met and married in Fort Worth, moved to New Orleans. So we have Oswald telling the FBI that he met and married Marina in Fort Worth, Texas, and moved to New Orleans. Now, we know that Oswald met with the FBI in June or July, shortly after he returned from Russia. He met with Agent Fain, and when Agent Fain retired a couple months later, the case was moved, the Oswald case file was moved over to Agent James Hosty, whom we all know and are familiar with. Oswald goes on to say that after coming to New Orleans, he said he began reading various pieces of literature distributed by the FPCC, and it was his understanding from reading this material that the main goal and theme of the committee is to prevent the United States from invading or attacking Cuba or interfering in the political affairs of that country. Further, that the people of this country should be given an opportunity to go visit Cuba, and in this way they can make up their own minds as to what the internal conditions of Cuba are like at the present time. He says he does not consider the Fair Play for Cuba Committee to be communist or a communistic controlled group. Oswald said that inquiry in New Orleans developed the fact that there apparently was a chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans, but he did not know any of the members or where their offices were located. He said he sent a letter to the headquarters of Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New York City together with $5 and told them he wished to join this committee. During the latter part of May of this year, he received a membership card in this organization with which bore a date of May 28th, 63, and was made out in the name of Lee Oswald and was signed by V.L. Lee. Should be V.T. Lee, but he described his card as being gray in color and signifying membership in the national organization. A short time thereafter, he said he received in the mail a white card which showed that he was made a member of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and this card was dated June 6, 63. It was signed by A.J. Heidel, and it bore in the lower right-hand corner the number 33, which said he indicated membership number. Oswald had in his possession both cards and exhibited both of them to me. Since becoming a member of the National Committee, Oswald said that he has been receiving the monthly circular of the committee, which is about 7 pages in length. He claimed that he cannot recall the name of this publication. Since receiving his membership card in the New Orleans chapter of the committee, he said that he had spoken with Heidel on the telephone on several occasions. On these occasions, Heidel would discuss general matters of mutual interest in connection with committee business, and on other occasions he would inform him of a scheduled meeting. He said he has never personally met Heidel, and he knows Heidel did have a telephone, but it has now been disconnected. He claimed that he could not recall what the number was. Okay, so what the hell is Oswald doing here? He's claiming to the FBI that A.J. Heidel is a real person, that he's spoken with him on the phone. Not sure what he's doing here. Oswald said that the committee did not have any offices in New Orleans, and whenever meetings were held, they were held in residences of various members. He maintained that he had attended only 2 meetings of this committee, and at each of the meetings there were about 5 different individuals, even though he's member number 33. At each of these meetings, the persons were different. Persons present were different. He did not know the last names of any of these individuals and claimed he was only introduced to them by first names. He maintained that he could not recall any of the first names of anybody that he met. Okay? From what he understands, there are no regularly scheduled times for meetings, and the only way he knows about them is when somebody gives him a call and tells him there will be a meeting. At these meetings, he said the general conversation deals with Cuba and the latest news on the internal affairs of Cuba. Oswald admitted that on one occasion he held a committee meeting at his home, but he declined to elaborate on how he got word to the various members that it would be held. Last Wednesday, August 7th, Oswald said he received a note through the mail from Heidel. The note asked him if he had time, would he mind distributing some fair play literature in the downtown area of New Orleans. He said Heidel knew that he was not working and probably had the time. Heidel also knew that he had considerable literature on the committee, which had been furnished to him by the National Committee in New York. Since he did not have anything else to do, Oswald said he decided to go down to Canal Street and distribute some literature. He denied that he was being paid for his services, but that he was doing it as a patriotic duty. About 1 p.m. on August 9th, Oswald said he went down to Canal Street by himself and started distributing committee literature. He said he had made up a placard which he hung around his neck with a piece of string. The placard was made up of brown cardboard, and on that placard were several pieces of literature which expressed the aims and purposes of the committee. At the bottom of the cardboard placard, he said he had printed in black capital letters the words Viva Fidel. From this time until around 4 p.m., he said he distributed a throwaway which was prepared on yellow paper, size 6 by 9, which contained the following: Hands off Cuba. Join the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, New Orleans Charter Member Branch, Free Literature, Lectures, Location, A.J. Heidel, P.O. Box 30016, New Orleans, Louisiana. Everybody is welcome. Sorry, I had to clear my throat there. In addition, Oswald said he had on his person membership applications, which he would pass out to anyone he thought desired one. This membership application was prepared on a white piece of paper, 3.5 by 8.5 in length, and it contained the following information. 2. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee, New Orleans, Louisiana. A.J. Heidel, P.O. Box 30016, New Orleans, Louisiana. Blank, I wish to join the committee, enclosed with my initiation fee of $1, and the dues are $1 a month. Blank, I cannot participate as an active member of the committee, but I wish to become a subscriber to mailings, enclosed, fine $5 for 1 year. Blank, I would like to have a more active part in supporting the cause of the FPCC, enclosed is my contribution for blank. Name blank, address blank, city blank, zone blank, state blank. Oswald stated in addition to this that he had on his person several copies of a 39-page pamphlet entitled The Crime Against Cuba by Corliss Lamont, which he carried with him as it contained all the information regarding this committee and he would be in a position to refer to it for proper answers in the event someone questioned him regarding the aims and purposes of the committee. Oswald had in his possession at the time of the interview a copy of the above three described documents and made available a copy of each to the agent. Around 4 p.m., while standing in the immediate vicinity of Walgreens drugstore, Canal and Barone Streets, Oswald said 3 Cubans approached him, and he gave each one of the above described throwaways. These individuals became very angry, tore up the throwaways, threw them down on the sidewalk, and began arguing with him. This created quite a disturbance, and shortly thereafter the police arrived, and he, as well as other individuals with whom he understood to be Cuban exiles, was arrested. For further identification, Oswald exhibited to me a U.S. Marine Corps Inactive Reserve TV5 identification card which showed that Lee Harvey Oswald, USM serial number 1653230, had served on active duty from period of October 24th, 56 to September 11th, 59. This ID card had been signed by Lieutenant A.G. Ayers, USMCR. From observation and questioning, Oswald is described as follows. White male, 23, DOB is October 1839, place of birth, New Orleans. And then in parentheses it says, at time of arrest claimed he was from Cuba. So we have Oswald telling him that he was born in Cuba. Okay. Height, 5'9", 140 pounds, slender, light brown, eyes, blue hazel. Teeth, good. Marital status. Wife, Marina Oswald, née Prasa. Occupation, former mechanic. U.S. Marine Corps, October, blah, blah, blah. Denies any criminal record and states lives at 4907 Magazine Street, New Orleans, Louisiana. The Times-Picayune, New Orleans, Louisiana, on August 13th contained the following news article. Lee Oswald, 23, of 4907 Magazine Street, Monday was sentenced to pay a fine of $10 or serve 10 days in jail on a charge of disturbing the peace by creating a scene. Oswald was arrested by 1st District Police at 4:15 p.m. Friday in the 700 block of Canal while he was reportedly distributing pamphlets asking for a fair play for Cuba. Police were called to the scene when 3 Cubans reportedly sought to stop Oswald. Municipal charges against the Cubans for disturbing the peace were dropped by the court. A confidential source familiar with Cuban activities in the New Orleans area were contacted during the month of September, and each advised he had no knowledge of regarding Oswald or any of the activities of subject organization in New Orleans, except the information regarding Oswald's arrest and distribution of handbills. Mrs. Jesse James Garner of 4909 Magazine Street advised on October 1st that Mr. and Mrs. Oswald had vacated their apartment on September 25th, 63. Mrs. Oswald and a young child left in a station wagon bearing Texas plates driven by same woman who had brought Mrs. Oswald to New Orleans from Texas. Lee Oswald told Mrs. Garner that his wife is going to have a baby and that she was going to Texas for the event. She said Oswald left owing her 17 days' rent for the apartment. On October 7th, NOT1 advised there is no such post office box as 30016 in the New Orleans area. Back to his landlady, Miss Jesse James Garner, stated on October 7th that Lee Oswald and his wife did not have any meeting to her knowledge when he was residing at 4907 Magazine Street. She advised that they did have some friends, approximately 3 or 4 people who used to visit them on occasions. She had no information as to the identity of these persons. She stated that she had not learned where Oswald had gone, but presumed he had returned to Texas. On October 15th, NOT2, who is cognizant of some CP activities, Communist Party, in the New Orleans area advised that T2 is not acquainted with Oswald or his wife and had no knowledge of any activities on the part of subject organization in New Orleans. On October 7, 1963, inquiry made at the New Orleans Retailers Credit Bureau failed to indicate there was anyone with a credit record in New Orleans by the name of A.J. Heidel. The city directory of New Orleans contained no record of anyone with a phone in the name of A.J. Heidel. On September 12, 1963, confidential informant NOT3 made available a transcript of a radio broadcast emanated from radio station WDSU in New Orleans on August 21, 1963, from the program known as Conversation Carte Blanche. This transcript revealed that on August 21st, Lee Harvey Oswald appeared on the aforementioned radio program along with Ed Butler, executive director of the Inca chapter of New Orleans, which organization specializes in the distribution of anti-communist educational material throughout Latin America. Also on the program was Carlos Bringuier, a Cuban refugee connected with the Revolutionary Student Directorate. Both Butler and Bringuier are anti-Castro, and during this program debated with Oswald. Some of the pertinent statements made by Oswald during this program included the following: that the FPCC is not communist controlled, and that he, Oswald, is a Marxist. Now, it goes on and on and on, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you because we'd be here all day. And I don't want to be here all day. I got stuff to do, people to see, things to go to, and coronavirus to escape. But that was pretty much it. So we have almost 20-page report by Quigley that I'd never seen before until I came across it, and I'd always wondered what was in it and what was said, and now we know. A very weird interaction, very weird things talked about in this interaction, but nothing like what I thought it was going to be. Now, before we get into Weisberg in New Orleans, I'm going to be reading some excerpts from a previously unpublished Harold Weisberg book. And all this stuff can be found at the Hood College, archives. And it's going to be from a chapter on Garrison and previously unpublished in Oswald in New Orleans, which Harold Weisberg wrote in 1967. So this should be new material for everybody in case you've been to the website and read through Harold Weisberg's unpublished manuscripts. But what's interesting, there's one thing that really jumped out to me in what I'm about to tell you, and it does concern Oswald's altercation with Carlos Bringuier. Now, those of you that listen to Doug's show, The Dallas Action, and mine as well, we've told you about a film called the John T. Martin film, and it shows some very peculiar stuff on it. Now, this fella was either a fan of General Walker or a former subordinate of General Walker who admired him greatly. Anyway, the film starts off, I think the guy lived somewhere in like Minneapolis or something, but it shows him taking off in a plane. It shows him landing in Dallas and going to General Walker's house, and it shows the window that Oswald supposedly shot through at General Walker's house. It shows the mailbox at Turtle Creek Boulevard. And then it cuts to New Orleans on August 9th, 1963 at 4:15 p.m. as Oswald gets in an altercation with Carlos Bringuier and company and is arrested. And he films all these FPCC, hands off Cuba flyers littered all over the sidewalk before it fades to black. Very odd that this would be something akin to mere happenstance, folks. And me and Doug have put forth, that this is something that was, because by this time, it wasn't really common knowledge that Lee Harvey Oswald had supposedly taken a shot at General Walker. At least according to the public. Now, from what General Walker's letters and other information are gleaned, is that apparently he had a source in the Dallas Police Department who informed him that a Lee Harvey Oswald and a Jack Ruby were picked up shortly after the shooting, but turned loose on the orders of Robert Kennedy. I'm not kidding. I'm just telling you what General Walker knew or believed. And it didn't really matter if it wasn't true. If Walker believed that it was true, and he was formulating a revenge plot against the Kennedys, then who better to make his patsy, the guy who would take the fall for all this, the guy who had allegedly shot at him, and who Robert Kennedy turned loose. But anyway, I digress. So as we get into Weisberg in New Orleans, about halfway through this chapter on the Jolly Green Giant, I came across some interesting stuff. Now, and this is out nowhere, so turn your ears on for this one, folks. In the middle of this chapter, I'm going to read you something here in a little bit. Oswald's most spectacular exploit in New Orleans was to get himself arrested by provoking one Carlos Bringuier into attacking him, allegedly. Bringuier was so far into the right political extreme that after his Warren Commission testimony, he went on speaking tours under the sponsorship of one of the earliest far-right religious exploiters of radio and the money it could get pouring in. That man's name was Billy Joe Hargis. You can't make this shit up, folks. Now, where have we heard that name before? Well, him and a fella by the name of General Edwin Walker used to go on midnight rides across the United States spouting their far-right bullshit and anti-communist propaganda. Weisberg states, despite Bringuier's indebtedness to Hargis, he is not mentioned in Bringuier's poor apology for a book that at its best never rises to mediocrity. It has fewer than 120 small pages of text. Its largely pointless appendix is one of less than 30 pages, but the appendix does include newspaper stories about Bringuier, along with other meaninglessness. Oddly, in his criticisms of some critics, he makes no mention of me. Why this is so odd follows. Charles Hallberg and Company published it in 1969, 2 years after the incident. Reflecting Bringuier's modesty, the Dust Jacket describes his book that appeared so long after so many that did in fact deal with the assassination as the true story in all its gruesome detail of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on the day that will go down in history as, followed by the book's title in red letters, Red Friday. The book has no bibliography. In his lengthy dedication to my son Carlos, Weisberg's a dick. Bringuier refers to those critical of the official mythology as fellow travelers. On his part, Hargis slunk into well-deserved oblivion in the wake of a brilliant song that was a spoof expose of him that, with a peppy tune, became a radio hit. Bringuier had a Havana law degree, but in New Orleans he was just plain nuts. He was the New Orleans delegate of the Cuban Student Directorate, the DRE. He had not been a student for quite a few years, and he was the only DRE member in New Orleans. I had no interest in Bringuier at all from his commission testimony, but he apparently luxuriated in the belief that he was the most important witness, and that anyone who did not think so had to be a communist. Bringuier, along with his brother-in-law, owned Casa Roca, a Cuban sort of general store at 107 Decatur Street close to the river. He also catered to sailors, and despite his pretenses and religious sponsorship, had X-rated books on display in his store window. Ooh. Porno. Another Warren Commission witness who did interest me had one of the 4 bars. He then owned the Havana Bar and Grill, so close to Bringuier's there was but one storefront between them, the Grad Printing Company. So, according to the commission, Oswald staged a spectacular drunk at Horace Pena's Havana Bar and Grill, which was only one storefront away from Carlos Bringuier's store. So, wow. You know, I knew New Orleans was small, but not that damn small. I mean, you got all these characters intermingled, intermatched, know each other, know what they're doing. And here we go again, folks. I could not believe it when I saw it. Billy James Hargis. We have a connection between General Walker and idiots in New Orleans. Useful idiots in New Orleans. But we'll get back to Arrest Pena and Harold Weisberg's actual interactions with the man himself, Arrest Pena, in New Orleans when we get back to his manuscript. But before we do, I just wanted to give you a little background on Harold Weisberg. For those of you out there who don't know, he was a former investigative reporter. Now, this was a biography composed for the HSCA. Senate investigator, decorated wartime intelligence analyst. He is the one person to devote himself full-time to personal and in-depth investigations of the political assassinations, beginning with that of President Kennedy. He is the one person the Department of Justice says knows more about the JFK assassination than anyone in the FBI. His investigations of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King led to the book Frame Up and to a reopening of the case of James Earl Ray, whose investigator Mr. Weisberg became. Mr. Weisberg has made more use of the FOIA Act than anyone else. He was responsible for influencing Congress to amend and strengthen the Act in 1974 and enact these amendments over the veto of President Ford, who had been a member of the Warren Commission. He is also alone in having a mandate from a federal appeals court which held that his investigation served the interests of the nation, and that to serve these interests he must take first-person testimony from a series of FBI agents who had retired to avoid being questioned under oath by him. As a Senate investigator, Mr. Weisberg investigated detective agencies and labor spying and strike-breaking outfits, as well as Bloody Harlan County in Kentucky, where murders to prevent union organization were numerous. During this period, he was used as an expert by the Department of Justice. In his World War II investigative reporting, Mr. Weisberg also helped the DOJ and other government agencies. He became an expert on Nazi cartels and Japanese aggression. His work led to a number of official actions against corporations fronting for the Nazis. His writings also predicted the attack on Pearl Harbor. Recently, when he invoked the Freedom of Information Act with the CIA, it gave him records of his having provided President Franklin Delano Roosevelt with evidence for one of his more famous fireside chats on the planned Nazi coup in South America that were frustrated by exposure. Before Pearl Harbor, he had been an unpaid British economic warfare agent. As a wartime OSS intelligence analyst, Weisberg's work included special missions for the White House. His other assignments ranged from conducting investigations that freed intelligence men who had been jailed after police framing, to writing the secret history of OSS, forerunner of the CIA, to preparing position papers on foreign policy. Whitewash, the report on the Warren Report, completed in mid-February '65, was the first book on the subject. It remains in print and a basic work. After the original publisher, whose father was an intelligence agent, broke the publishing contract, and after more than 100 rejections, often accompanied by hearty editorial praises, Mr. Weisberg invented the underground book, and Whitewash became a bestseller. He has remained a publisher. He has published 7 definitive and original books on political assassinations. He is used as an expert consultant by book, magazine, and newspaper publishers. Mr. Weisberg was the first to excavate the secrets buried in the National Archives. Beginning with his first book, all his works have included the facsimile reproduction of these former secrets. The fourth of the Whitewash series has more than 100 pages in which the top secret stamps are visible. These pages represent the Warren Commissioner's deliberations on reports that Oswald had been an American intelligence agent. After obtaining this transcript by suing the government, Mr. Weisberg forced it to give him another of these top secret transcripts, which revealed the Commission's recognition that the intelligence agencies had predetermined its conclusions before it held a single hearing. In this case, the existing records, also secret, showed that this transcript had been destroyed. The stenotypist tape escaped destruction, however. Mr. Weisberg forced the government to transcribe it and give it to him. It is printed in his most recent book, Post-Mortem. It shows that the Commission agreed with the urging of former CIA Director Allen Dulles, who says, and I quote, "I think this record should be destroyed." Post-Mortem also includes many reproductions of evidence the Warren Commission did not have, such as the suppressed JFK death certificate and the experts' findings, readings of the JFK autopsy file. The few authentic experts in the field regard Mr. Weisberg as the preeminent authority. He has done and continues to do most of the original work. He speaks on the JFK and Martin Luther King Jr. assassinations and on the Freedom of Information Act. Where possible, he also holds seminars. So, he was a very respected researcher, no-nonsense kind of guy. Again, not a fan of people like Mark Lane, anybody who had Looney Tune accusations. He wasn't a fan of Jim Mars. He wasn't a fan of Oliver Stone. And in fact, spoke out highly against them. And, in this day and age of, and I'm not even going to call myself a preeminent researcher because I'm not. But, I'm still, I guess you could say, a public figure since I do this show. And of course the show has listeners and it has fans and it has people that like to share things. And people send me stuff all the time about the assassination, whether it be documents or videos or their thoughts on different things. And, one thing about Harold Weisberg is he always took the time to save the correspondence, the letters written to him, and his responses to those letters. And he corresponded with hundreds of researchers back then, via the mail. And, just one example is, a guy sent an article from the Washington Post, the Arizona Republic from March 75, which talks about the Church Committee and the CIA and Jack Anderson, and sent him the article and also sent him a letter along with the article. And, people would write stuff like this to Weisberg all the time. Where he says, a former Johnson aide, Leo Janos, died in a 73 article in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. Said Johnson once declared that after he took office in 64, he discovered that we had been operating a damn Murder Incorporated in the Caribbean. Murder Inc. was, of course, the CIA. Number 2, a high-level CIA official has stated in a not for attribution interview that the CIA never assassinated anybody, but further stated he would not make a flat statement that we had never had anything to do with such things. There were some things that were a little closer to the edge. Number 3, columnist Jack Anderson reported in 1971 that he had reestablished that the CIA sponsored six assassination attempts in Cuba, the last in the spring of 1963, and President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. So, it just goes on and on and on. And this is just a letter from a guy named John Latta, who was a CPA in Scottsdale, Arizona, just writing Harold Weisberg because he was a fan of what he was doing and, wanted to contribute. And Weisberg got these letters all the time and always took the time to answer people in kind, on top of, writing extensively. While he has 7 published books, there's at least manuscripts for 3, 4, 5 unpublished books, in the Hood College archive, and one of them is a fascinating read. If you ever like to check it out, it pretty much kills, and I mean kills, his fellow conspiracy research authors and their findings. I mean, he pretty much takes them to task one by one and beats the hell out of them. Throws them down the street, punches them in the face, and drags them up out of the gutter and onto the sidewalk and punches them some more. But it's a crazy read. Check it out sometime you got time. So, back to Weisberg in New Orleans. And we're just going to hit the high points here. I'm not going to read you the entire 30-page chapter on the Jolly Green Giant, as it's titled. But he starts it off saying, although it was more than 2 years in becoming a matter of judicial fact, almost 2 years before I could not avoid recognizing it, as I should have almost from the outset of this particular, of his spectacular assassinations adventure, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, when lost himself, found others to blame for it. Garrison, who died in 1993, was one of the most gifted, erudite, articulate, and when he wanted to be, one of the most eloquent and charming men I ever met. He was an authentic intellectual. He had limitless self-confidence, and if he ever acknowledged making a mistake, being worried about anything at all, it is without my recollection of it. Beginning in November 1966, in secret and in public, the middle of February 1967, he was off on what was locally referred to as his probe of the JFK assassination. It is not possible to assess or report on the side of JFK assassination industry other than the government's without him. He gave disagreement with the official mythology an entirely new aspect of substituting theory for fact. His were the first of the most imaginative and widely accepted and published theories of the assassination. He presented them all as fact, and there was nothing he ever did, said, or reflected that indicated he did not really and truly believe them. All of them, many as they are, all included those that contradicted each other. Collecting them all and listing them with the ramifications, modifications, and enlargement of each would take an extraordinary amount of time. He was given his nickname, the Jolly Green Giant, after the brand name of consumer-ready Wisconsin agricultural products, by Dean Andrews, a New Orleans lawyer. That nickname became so popular in Louisiana that there were even T-shirts with a large green thumbprint that read, "I've been touched by the Jolly Green Giant." I totally want one. I was given one by a police narcotics informer who became an informant for me. More on her later. He says, I introduced Andrews in assassination literature in 1965 in my first book, Whitewash. Of all the 552 claimed commission witnesses, including FBI and other experts on the shooting, it was Andrews who gave its most probative, most informative, most comprehensive, and most unwelcome testimony on marksmanship. After all I had learned about shooting before, after, and when in the Army in World War II, after all the commission expert testimony I had read and sometimes studied, and after all the expert testimony Jim Lazar and I took when we deposed 5 of the FBI's experts in several of my FOIA lawsuits, and after all the innumerable great number of FBI lab records relating to shooting that I had read after getting them in those lawsuits, and for all I've read in the literature on both sides in some 30 years, there is no testimony at all that compares in its dependability and informativeness as with Andrews. And he volunteered it in his July 21st, 64 deposition when he was questioned by Wesley Liebler in the old civil courts building at Royal and Conti Streets in the ancient New Orleans French Quarter. It is for this reason that I remind readers of it by repeating parts of page 24 and 25 of Whitewash so they can know what was available to all who thereafter wrote on the subject or made what so many without consultation with their dictionaries referred to as their investigations of the assassination. This is how that book's fourth chapter, The Marksman, begins. The essence of intelligence, Allen Dulles, commission member and former head of the Central Intelligence Agency, once said, is to get one fact and bulldog it to death. Unfortunately, as a commission member, Dulles did not practice what he preached. Had he done so, the Dallas shootings would have busied the bulldogs for years. There's no single thing that is proved beyond a reasonable doubt about the marksman, the rifle, the ammunition, the shooting, or the number of shots, except that President Kennedy was killed, Tippit was killed, and Governor Connally was wounded. The report evades much of the solid evidence the Commission could not avoid developing, misuses the testimony to which it does refer, ignores and compounds the sins of the police agencies, escapes the obvious, and involves unalloyed speculation in contradictory forms. In a murder by gunshot investigation, such a central fact that should be bulldogged, and wasn't, by the Commission, is the possibility that the shooting it theorized was not possible. So, here is what Dean Andrews stated to the Commission. He emphasized, he stated that Oswald had not and could not have killed President Kennedy. He emphasized the point that the Commission had never asked all the experts quoted. Marksmanship is a skill that requires a high degree of coordination and practice. I am basing my opinion on 5 years as an ordnance man in the Navy. You can lean into those things, and with throwing the bolts, if I couldn't do it myself, 8 hours a day, doing this for a living, constantly on the range, I know this civilian couldn't do it. He might have been a sharp marksman at one time, but if you don't lean into that rifle and don't squeeze and control consistently, your brain can tell you how to do it, but you don't have the capability to fire 3 shots, controlled with accuracy. This boy couldn't do it. Commission Assistant Wesley Liebler asked, you base that judgment on the fact in your own experience it is difficult to do that sort of thing? To which Dean Andrews says, you just don't pick up a rifle or a pistol or whatever weapon you are using and stay proficient with it. You have to know what you're doing. Somebody else pulled the trigger. It's just taking the 5 years experience that I have and thinking about it a bit. I have fired as much as 40,000 rounds of ammo a day for 7 days a week. You get pretty good with it as long as you keep firing. Then I've gone back after 2 weeks. I used to be able to take a shotgun, go on a skeet, and pop 100 out of 100. After 2 weeks, I could pop only 60 of them. I would have to start again. Same way with the rifle and machine guns. Every other person I knew, same thing happened to them. You just have to stay in it. Nobody ever, before the Commission or anywhere else, ever undertook to rebut what Andrews testified to, and nobody did. The Commission did not merely neglect this Andrews testimony, it ignored it, and so did Garrison. But of course, Garrison had a different interest in Andrews' testimony. He was only worried about the homosexual activities of a mysterious Clay Bertrand. So, he goes on to say how peculiar a city New Orleans is. You know, how they call uptown. And what is uptown in New Orleans is downtown in every other city I've been in. Then there are streets that have different names when they cross Canal Street, the main drag beginning at the Mississippi's edge. The strips of curved grassland between the one-way halves of the streets is known as the neutral ground, as though each half of the street was at war with each other. Notwithstanding the fact that for a newcomer or visitor it can mean 3 different directions, and the Crescent City direction is sometimes given as the riverside, referring to a part of town or the side of the street. The French Quarter, the Fat Tuesday, and so on and so forth. He states that when he was brought to New Orleans several times by Garrison. He was put up at the Fontainebleau Hotel under an assumed name. And one of the times he said, "We got a report that there's a hit to be on you. So we want a connecting room. We'll have to wait till they are ready." Lynn Loisel went up to the desk, used a phony name for himself, and checked me in as Mr. Anthony Dunn. They all knew me at the motel, but nobody cracked a smile. They sure knew him. That coffee shop was a favorite pub. So apparently, somebody in New Orleans was out to get old Harold Weisberg. The connecting room opened onto the large, bright inside square with the pools and many tables and chairs. And of course, they took that room for themselves with a hit supposedly on me. As soon as we got there, they told me they had to bug my room for my security. So they drilled a hole at the top of the connecting door jamb, inserted a spiked mic, tested it on a large reel-to-reel tape recorder they had, one that accommodated a 7-inch reel for many hours of recording. Their wireman, whose name was George, told me he also wanted an FM bug. So soon he was taping it to the underside of a chair. I said, "Now wait a minute, George. How am I going to turn on the switch on that thing without being seen? Let me have it in my pocket." "No sweat. Just reach your hand down there. You can feel the switch. Just push it." Not anticipating any need to use that bug, I just forgot about it. I really had to contort to reach that switch, and it would have been pretty conspicuous. There was a woman justifiably regarded as a good source. She knew New Orleans like very few people. I did not want to try to take extensive notes, and I carried my own tape recorder, but once they had the room wired, I decided not to use my machine because so many people act up a little bit and exaggerated a bit when they were taped, and it would just be a natural conversation with my tape recorder visibly not in use. So I invited her to dinner and asked if she would talk to me afterwards. She said, "I have no babysitter." So of all the unlikely possibilities, I got David Ferry's godson, Morris Brownlee, to babysit her little girl who was 9 years old. Not sure if that was the smartest move, Harold, but okay. He goes on to state that I am the one who brought Ferry's involvement in the FBI and Warren Commission investigations to light. Garrison had charged Ferry as one of the 3 assassination conspirators, and this young man babysat so I could question that fine woman about what she knew about so many people, including his godfather, Oswald, who Garrison had so often stated killed nobody. So he goes on, they had a nice little talk with his informant, who he named D. Now, it goes on to say, he's describing the NOAC, which is the New Orleans Athletic Club. So this is where Garrison believed that there was less chance the FBI would tap his phone calls. So he used it as a second office. It had a variety of rooms he could use for that purpose. Several that he used were dining rooms, and he had a blackboard in the largest of them. And did he use it? All the, quote, critics who could poured into New Orleans except for Sylvia Marr. She immediately, and as it turned out accurately, castigated Garrison as an Ayn Rand character. My judgment was bad. I actually believed him when he explained away all the things he said he should not have said, and all the really crazy stuff he seemed to believe. He said he was fighting fire with fire. The government was, he said, giving him a hard time, so he was returning the favor. Excuse me. I was not in on most of the shenanigans, partly because I had no interest in Clay Shaw whatsoever. I was interested in learning as much as I could about Lee Harvey Oswald and his life and connections there. That seemed not to interest Garrison at all. And it goes into the Bringuier incident that I read you a little bit before. And apparently Weisberg had went to Bringuier's shop, and he was going to take a picture of it. And he says, I had not even had the time to focus the old reflex camera I was using when Bringuier came rushing from his store, running in a fairly full crouch yet. With each couple steps, he snapped a picture with his 35mm camera, and when he got to me, he was about to jump me when the detective chased him off. Years later, when I got the New Orleans FBI files, I discovered that Bringuier was a disappointed man when he took those pictures to the FBI to give them. That they saw no value in them probably convinced him that the FBI too was communist, but reluctantly they accepted those pictures when he persisted. Do you know what they call Bringuier in the Cuban community? A fellow by the name of Bill Martin. I did not, of course, so he told me. They call him El Estupides. Assuming correctly that I would interpret that as meaning stupid, he said, and that means the stupidity. He goes on to talk about Orestes Pena. He says, for a while, Pena and I were friends, and it happened in a strange way. One night I returned from the archives in Washington. My wife told me that he had phoned and that she had told him when I'd be home. He said he would call then. Several hours passed that time he did. I had, and I later always had, trouble with his accent. Orest had immigrated before Castro, and he had a good command of English, but a very heavy accent. He introduced himself, said he only had a short amount of time because he was in the hospital awaiting the reading of x-rays. He had been clubbed with a lead pipe. He had just seen my book, he said, and if I would come to New Orleans, he would give me another book. He attributed that lead piping to his commission testimony, although he made no effort to explain why. I did not understand why either. On my next trip, it was apparent that he did not have another book to offer, but that he had and he could lead me to worthwhile information about Oswald. The biggest surprise on the next trip was Horace Pena's new car. It was the purplest of purple Cadillacs that I had ever seen, with all the extras, bells, and whistles, and he was proud of it too. He told me he had gotten it when they, in quotes, caused an accident with his then car. He meant that they had tried to kill him with a lead pipe to the head, and then by totaling his car. Fuck it, he said. They kill me, so they kill me. Until they do, I live it up. That meant a purple caddy to him. That trip, Orest insisted that we dine and spend the rest of the nights together while he told me what he thought I should know. We did dine together each night of the first week I was there. He even took me to the Playboy Club, of which he was a member, for drinks. He taught me never to order scotch and water. They give you the cheapest bar scotch they have and charge you a high price. Order by brand, and they think you know your whiskey and give you what you order. His recommendation for the scotch that goes best with water were Chivas Regal and J&B. That made me a J&B man for years. Chivas cost too much for me. All that week he was telling me stories of a Mexican reporter with whom he saw Oswald often. His account of that alleged spectacular Oswald drunk was not at all the official version of it, and he got two of his employees who were there to talk to me to confirm it. They spoke no English, but he was the translator. I taped those interviews. The barmaid, Armanda Jarvis, was no problem. We interviewed her on the job, but his barkeep on the night shift, Evaristo Rodriguez, was homesick. He had the mumps. I'd already had them, so Orest drove me to where they lived anyway. Having the mumps, I asked Evie if the doctor had told him to stay off his feet. The doctor had not, so I told him that it could develop into orchitis. By the time that was translated and discussed in Spanish by all three, Evaristo Rodriguez seemed to have the wrong idea and believed that the complication could render him impotent. From that moment on, I had a new friend. Now, two new friends, his wife too. Evie did testify on deposition before the Warren Commission lawyer Wesley Liebler in New Orleans on July 21st, 64. It was an assembly line deposition day, and quite a few were deposed that day by Liebler. He rushed them through. Before Evie's testimony, he had Dean Andrews, and after it he had Pena. Liebler's translator was FBI Special Agent Robert Logan. Orest's brother Ruperto also testified. So there's a lot of these Cubans in New Orleans that were testifying that day. for the depositions, that was lengthy testimony. It is, for example, more than 10 times the length of Liebler's deposition of Linda K. Willis, who was as close as any other eyewitness to the president when he was killed and was looking at him when the bullets hit him. It is 3 times the length of Liebler's deposition of James Tague, the third man wounded in the assassination. It is also 3 times the length of Liebler's deposition of a man who was an assassination witness and who took famous movie of the assassination, Abraham Zapruder. It's 4 times the length of the deposition of Seymour Weitzman, who both retrieved a piece of the president's skull and was one of those who found the well-hidden rifle allegedly used by Oswald. Okay, he goes on and on and on and on. Liebler's chief interest was in building a case, any kind of case, against Oswald. The commission lawyer's proud boast was that Truth was their only client. What was of special interest to Liebler was the report that Oswald had gone into arrest Havana Bar and Grill drunk as a coot and made a spectacle of himself in the drunkenness by making a scene, ordering a lemonade only. In that tough area of that tough waterfront, the bar people did not even know how to make a lemonade. The official line is that Oswald was also sick in his drunk and made a mess, and that he left staggering in his drunkenness as he left. While this is not the place for all I learned about Oswald in New Orleans, this business of that drunk, used so prejudicially by Liebler and the commission, is illustrative. R.S. had told me that it was a fake, a put-up job, whether by Oswald or by what I referred to from the first as a false Oswald. Whitewash, page 137. There were confirmations of the counterfeiting of Oswald, while they could not entirely be ignored by the commission, and its lawyers were ignored in their work and in their report. There is doubt in the minds of those Cubans that the man who created the memorable disturbance so foreign to the disturbances in waterfront bars asking for a lemonade was the real Oswald. When there is no doubt about on the parts of all 3 bar employees who were witnesses to it, as they told me, is that the man was not drunk. They said that when he and his companion left the bar, he started walking straight, not staggering, and they both were laughing their heads off over the stunt they had just pulled. It is worth repeating that the translator was an FBI agent. Whether it was the real Oswald or a false one, that such a stunt had been staged by 2 men who found it hilarious was a matter of investigation once Oswald was the official candidate for assassin, and was officially alleged to be a loner, a lone nut assassin. But based on the transcript of the translated testimony, there is no basis for investigation of it. So that's interesting. Comes out that whoever was playing Oswald, or if it was Oswald, wasn't really drunk. So then we get into this business about somebody named Philip. And this young man, hang on one second. It was a Philip Garachi, and a friend named Vance Blaylock. And the mother remembered clearly that Philip had told her that he and Vance wanted to get some of their Civil Air Patrol uniforms. She drove them to near Bringuier's store the day she had a dental appointment near it. She remembered that this was as soon as schools were out for the summer. Both parents remembered Philip later telling them that that is when he saw Oswald. Oswald had spoken to both boys about what he had learned and experienced in the Marines while they waited for Bringuier to be free. The date was shortly after Oswald got to New Orleans from Fort Worth. It was not in August, though. It was in May. It was also on that day that Bringuier had asked the boys to sell what he referred to as a Cuban freedom bonds at 50 cents each. The father Gott showed me and mailed me copies of Bringuier's handwritten receipts for the small sums Philip had collected from selling those bonds, that as it turned out Bringuier had no right to sell. Bringuier wrote it all out and dated it 2 months earlier than he said he saw Oswald for the first time on August 5th. Both boys were sort of taken by Bringuier as a resistance fighter as he presented himself. They returned to his store several times, including the times Bringuier recorded on those receipts for the bonds Philip sold on other occasions. One of these occasions was recorded in the files of the juvenile squad of Jeff Parish, where the Garachis lived and of course which Garrison knew. The father, also named Philip, was a professional electrician. He killed himself by accident in the course of his work. The Army then returned Philip from Vietnam. Knowing from the commission testimony that Philip had been at Bringier's when Oswald was, on Philip Jr.'s return, Garrison served a grand jury subpoena on him. Philip ignored it, and in fact he ignored it 3 more times. So then, for some reason, Weisberg said, look, he convinced Garrison, said, look, let me go talk to the kid, and you leave him alone. So eventually, Garrison acquiesced, and Philip confirmed his many trips to Bringier's store, and that was on his first trip there, seeking parts of his CAP uniform with Vance Blaylock, that he heard Oswald offer Bringuier his Marine manual. It was entirely without value to Bringuier, who was not a resistance fighter in any event. He was only a propagandist. After interviewing Philip's parents and learning that the boys had been to Bringier's often and when they had seen Oswald for the first time and only time, I went to the archives and got a copy of what others never checked, the stenographic transcript of Philip's deposition. Philip had tried to tell Liebler that he had been to Bringier's more than once, but with the Secret Service information that Philip had seen Oswald months earlier than Bringuier, for his own reason, testified to rather than following that up, Liebler edited the transcript before it was published and eliminated that information from it. As published, the edited manuscript was Philip as at Bringier's only that one time the commission wanted. So you see, just crazy stuff. Now, when Liebler deposed Bringuier, he led Bringuier into testimony that was not the truth. It was particularly not truthful with respect to when the boys were at Bringier's when Oswald was there, and it was not truthful in the false representation that is in the transcript that the boys were there only one time. On Philip's part, it was a relationship in which he trusted Bringuier, an adult, when he was a troubled boy in high school. Philip was a Jeff Parrish juvenile case because he had run away from home. When away, he had kept in touch with informant D. I knew of that from her and from the Jeff Parrish juvenile case records. When he decided to return to the New Orleans area, D met him at a bus station, and instead of going home, Philip went to Bringuier, his adult friend, with D. Instead of sending the boy home or phoning the mother to tell her that his son was back and safe, Bringuier sent him to a nearby dive, a cheap flophouse called the Silver Dollar. The reception Philip got at that dive, a notorious homosexual flophouse, drove him out of there and right back home. It should be remembered that David Ferry had been charged by Garrison as part of the assassination conspiracy over which he and Clay Shaw indicated, and that Ferry, the professional pilot, had been leader in the Civil Air Patrol, of which Philip was a member as a few years earlier Oswald had been, and that Ferry had been fired by Eastern Airlines when he was arrested for offenses against underage boys. So, yeah. On another note, another of those CAP boys of Oswald's day, who of all remarkable coincidences Liebler also deposed, was Frederick S. O'Sullivan. By the time Liebler deposed him, O'Sullivan was actually a detective on the New Orleans Police Vice Squad. In that brief questioning, Liebler sought to establish that Oswald was not, to O'Sullivan's knowledge, a member of the CAP. By the questions he asked, he got the record to reflect what he wanted it to reflect. There's also something unusual about this testimony as it was published. As published, Liebler asked him, which was really telling him how to answer a deceptive question. You have never had any contact with Ferry and connections with your activities on the Vice Squad, is that correct? O'Sullivan's response is, no, Ferry lives in Jeff Parrish. We have no authority in Jeff Parrish. After this is in the printed testimony is, in quotes, deletion. There was an FBI report that it had the archives withhold. It is page 701 of the commission record identified as CD7. That is one of the earlier FBI multi-volume of collections of its reports, and that report says that O'Sullivan was in the Civil Air Patrol with Lee Harvey Oswald, and that Ferry did know Oswald. Now, what Liebler deleted from the testimony so it would not be published as part of the Commission's record is what follows the quotation above. Nothing omitted as I quote the stenographic transcript. I know that Ferry was arrested or was accused of some violating some vice laws, I believe having to do with homosexuals about 2 or 3 years ago, but I don't have personal knowledge of this. Whatever O'Sullivan may have meant by having no personal knowledge of Ferry's arrest was in fact by his unit of the police department. And whatever Liebler had in mind by suppressing it from the public record, it had been reported in the papers that Ferry's was a juvenile sex offense. Liebler's suppression of it did not protect Ferry's privacy. This adds to the wonder that he did not call Ferry as a witness when Ferry was a CAP leader and Oswald had been in it. In hiding the fact that Oswald was in fact in the CAP, Liebler led O'Sullivan to testify only that he had spoken to Oswald about joining the CAP when they were both students at Beauregard Junior High. The FBI records Liebler had, and of which I later got copies after the archives first suppressed them, have O'Sullivan as Oswald's recruiter into the CAP. There, in fact, was no question about Oswald's being in the CAP when Ferry was well known as a leader in it, and if Liebler had wanted, he could have gotten what I have, a picture of Oswald in his CAP uniform across the way from David Ferry. We've all seen the picture, folks. You know? I mean, it is what it is. He goes on to say that Garrison's defense, he was more interested in what had been found at Shaw's home when with a warrant it was searched, but he did not leak it. A reporter who covered the courts knew that the returns on search warrants were filed with the court. That is how it got out that Shaw had a collection of whips, chains, and costumes of various kinds. Shaw's lawyers told the reporters that the chains and whips were costumes for Mardi Gras parades. Garrison could have put that to rest with much prejudice to Shaw and his lawyers as a result, but to the best of my knowledge, he never mentioned what was observed in Shaw's bedroom. Across the ceiling of Shaw's bedroom was a length of 2x4 lumber, and in it were 2 large meat hooks, the kind of hooks on which heavy beef carcasses are hung by butchers. All around those hooks were smudges that sweaty palms could have made. Okay, Clay Shaw, what the hell are you doing? The FBI was well aware of Shaw's sexual preferences and practices and had been for years. It lied about this in public, and it lied under oath in my CA 780420, which was for all its records relating to the assassination of its New Orleans office. The New Orleans suit was specific in requesting all Shaw records. The FBI denied having any under oath, but at FBI headquarters a record somehow slipped through those who sought to withhold what could have been so embarrassing. It is a letterhead memorandum known in the FBI as an LHM. It is addressed to nobody, and it is signed by nobody. This headquarters FBI letterhead memo dated March 2nd, 67, and that's 2 weeks after the Garrison probe was first publicized. Those were 2 weeks of the heaviest media attention to it, 2 weeks during which many questions were addressed to the FBI, and it was a special day for another reason that follows. The heading on this memorandum is Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963, Dallas, Texas. Sorry, I'm just making sure I didn't skip anything. Apparently they did not include the thing. Oh, all that build up for nothing. Maybe he was going to add that later in his unpublished manuscript here. The date on this memo is the date Ramsey Clark, then acting Attorney General, testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee on his appointment to be Attorney General. He was briefed in advance that morning by the FBI, and at the Senate office building, the media asked him about Clay Shaw and whether or not he was Clay Bertrand. The same guy, Clark responded, and that made headlines across the country. Then the FBI denied it and denied it had told it to Clark. But it did, and that is why the record or file copy of its memo is a carbon copy. The FBI was not about to admit that it knew all about Shaw and had for years. Here's how the memo begins. This bureau received allegations as early as '54 that Clay Shaw, former managing director of the International Trade Mart in New Orleans, was a homosexual. One source informed this bureau on March 19, '64 that he has had relations of a homosexual nature with Clay Shaw. The source described Shaw as a brilliant and powerful man given to sadism and masochism in his homosexual activities. On February 24th, we received information from two other sources. That information available to them led them to believe Clay Shaw has homosexual tendencies. On February 24, '67, we received information from two sources that Clay Shaw reportedly is identical with an individual by the name of Clay Bertrand, who allegedly was in contact with Dean Andrews, a New Orleans attorney, in connection with Lee Harvey Oswald. That Shaw was a sadomasochist doesn't make him guilty of assassinating the president. He is dead. May he rest in peace. So also may the dead. Garrison. What can embarrass? It is spelled out in the memo to be bucked upward to the top echelon. A New Orleans informer told it that he had had a homosexual relationship with Shaw and that Shaw was a sadomasochist. That informer also knew of other sadomasochist relationships Shaw had, and two said he was known as Clay Bertrand. Garrison did not have this FBI headquarters record, and I got it 10 years after his case ended. But he did have the observations of his own detectives who executed the search warrant he got to permit a legal search of Shaw's home. Even if one forgets those smudges near those meat hooks, how many reasons can there be for meat hooks in a bedroom ceiling, especially with all those chains and whips? Whoopee, whoopee. So, he's pretty adamant that Garrison was on some kind of, he called him the Pink Panther. He says, how punk a neophyte Pink Panther was Garrison anyway? Can it be believed that he was really conducting an investigation or merely hunting down homosexuals? In his own mind and issuing from his own mouth repeatedly, he linked the three he charged as assassins in homosexuality. He is told that on the day after Ferry died, a boy who had been in the CAP, in which Ferry was an adult leader, is actually removed from within Garrison's jurisdiction, and in what amounts to a parent-assisted kidnapping by the police of two jurisdiction is removed from where Garrison could reach him and held away for 2 weeks. And as either the DA or the self-described assassination investigator, he had no interest at all. That's investigating. That's enforcing the law. What it really was is vintage Garrison. It is far from the only such Garrison refusal to investigate solid leads, including those he got from me. He was much better at speeches and statements to the press, and the clack usually around him with theories, claims of proof he did not have and that did not exist. His solutions, in quotes, that were what he and others imagined, and in claiming there was an official conspiracy to stifle him and end his probe. These did get him enormous attention and a large following. But Garrison himself saw to it that no such official efforts were needed. It should be remembered in reader assessment that Garrison charged Shaw, Ferry, and Oswald as assassins, yet he ignored this extraordinary business of a New Orleans and a Jeff Parrish officer kidnapping a boy as soon as Ferry was dead, who was in the CAP as Ferry was, and remarkably that Ferry fled New Orleans the first moment he could, the day of the assassination, as soon as Oswald was known to have been arrested. I brought the Ferry angle to light in my second book, Whitewash 2, Oswald in New Orleans. Also, Garrison had the manuscript of the proofs that summer when the publisher, without informing me of it, asked Garrison to write a foreword for it. In that book, I used the available FBI reports relating to Ferry, including his flight, his return, his keeping in touch with people in New Orleans to determine whether he was wanted, and of his return when he knew that Garrison, not the FBI, was looking for him. Having nothing at all on him, Garrison soon let him go. The questions that exist because the federal agencies and Garrison permitted them to exist by not investigating when there was so much that should have been investigated. And there you have it, folks. Weisberg in New Orleans. Not a fan of Jim Garrison and his tactics. And he was there to see it firsthand. And, he did some investigating for Garrison. And those are his feelings. And if you want to read more, there's a ton more over at the Hood College archives. So go check it out for yourself. And make sure you check it out. Also, folks, good Folkertons, check out me and my buddy Doug Campbell's new podcast called Quick Hits, a JFK assassination research news and notes podcast on the assassination. We have many, many informative shows, and a new one will be out soon. So make sure you're looking for it. You can follow me on Twitter at TheLoneGunman7. And on Facebook, just search for the Facebook page, The Lone Gunman Podcast. As always, folks, peace. And stay away from coronavirus. Wash your damn hands, people. Wash them.